In the world before World War II, we had an imperial system with the empires duking it out over access to everything, and trade as a rule needed to be militarized because every time there was a conflict, you would lose access to whatever happened, even if you weren't a party to the conflict. Shipping would be a target. So at the end of World War II, the Americans, who had the only Navy left in the game, said that they would put their Navy at the service of the global commons so that anyone could trade with anyone, anywhere, at any time, and access any market. And we came to know this as free trade and globalization. Now, there are two big implications from that. The first is that we were no longer in a world where if you wanted to be successful, you had to have iron ore and coal and steel and food. You only needed one of them now, and you could trade for the other three, and everyone started to industrialize together, starting from different points and moving at different speeds, but we all got on this path that we are all now very familiar with. And second, when people industrialized, they changed their personal habits and national economies evolved as well. So it used to be that you were probably living on a subsistence farm. And when you do that, kids are free labor. So you have a bunch. But when you move into the town to take industrial and services jobs, kids go from being free labor to really expensive habits, and adults aren't stupid, so we had fewer of them. You play that forward 75 years, and it's not that most of the world is running out of children. That happened 30 years ago. It's that now the world has run out of working age adults, and we're starting to run out of mature adults. Everyone's moving into mass retirement. So from a strategic point of view, globalization was based on America's commitment to the Cold War, which is long since over. And economically, the industrialization experience, the urbanization experience, has been about this bulge moving through the population structure that started with children, then turned into 20 and 30-somethings that was consumption heavy, then turned into 40 and 50-somethings, which were capital heavy, people saving for retirement, and now they're all moving into retirement. So the whole process has already played out. And under globalization, first with a lot of workers and with a lot of capital, we got the technological explosions that we know. But these were all nothing more than a moment in time, a moment that lasted 75 years, but it's now over. And so we now have to go back to what we had before World War II, but without people. The key thing to keep in mind for shipping, let me throw it into three general categories. Number one, 80% of the stuff that enables people to grow food is transported internationally, whether it's equipment or fertilizer or fuel. Only 20% of food is traded internationally, but 80% you need the inputs to grow it in the first place. Number two, roughly half of all oil is shipped on the ocean blue, typically by supertanker, along with everything that comes out of the Persian Gulf. And then number three, safety on the waves is what allows us to have the East Asian manufacturing model, which is a fancy way of saying the manufacturing model. Because roughly half of all manufactured goods are produced in East Asia, and you will get components coming from Thailand versus Indonesia versus China versus Korea versus Japan. But the key thing to remember is less than 1% of that shipping happens on land. Korea is in effect an island. Japan is an island. Most of the Southeast Asian countries are either islands or peninsulas, and they're ringed by mountains. So physical connections independent of maritime trade in Asia almost don't happen at all. Well, think of what just happened in the first week of December. So the Europeans announced their plan for an oil export ban, and a lot of the details are being made up as they go on. It's a very European policy in that regard. But what it is encouraging is a split in the way we view oil from the Russian space versus the rest of the world, and the different types of crude coming out of the Russian space. So the stuff the Europeans are primarily concerned about is Urals crude that is exported west to the European space, and that can only be sold for $60 or less now, and that's affecting insurance and shipping rates and the type of vessels that go in. And we saw over the course of the last 2 years how disruptions in simply the type of vessel being available can generate supply chain snarls. So now we're doing this with energy, but there's also a crude grade that exports to the Pacific that doesn't touch the European space at all, that trades differently. We now, just in the Russian space, have two fundamentally different markets, not just for pricing, but for physical accessibility, for the ability to get ships and insurance to allow it to move. One of the reasons why the world has been so stable, air quotes stable, since 1945 is there's been one oil price. Now, it's modified by the length of the journey or the quality of the crude, but there's one oil price and everything is safe. The Europeans have now created a system where a lot of countries in Europe are now going to have a vested interest in interfering with Russian exports west. That's one pricing margin. That's one security paradigm. That's one insurance policy system. But then in the east, where the Europeans are not players, it's a different crude grade at a different price point using different insurance systems by different countries, we have split the oil market now into at least three pieces, two Russian, one everything else, which means now countries no longer have a vested interest in making sure the oil flows everywhere all the time because we're not all in this together anymore. And this is just the beginning. We're going to see this spread throughout not just the energy sphere, but pretty much every major commodity. And we're hiving the world up into different supply systems. And that is a recipe for 1910s and 1930s style conflict. In the world before World War II, piracy, state piracy, and privateering were pretty common.
Really?
Because almost everything that was shipped had an obvious value. The cost of shipping before the Cold War and globalization was about an order of magnitude more than it was previous. And in the pre-industrial world, it was an order of magnitude more than that. In the pre-Deepwater era, it was an order of magnitude more. So interfering with shipping has always been very popular because you know that the value of the product's going to be high. It's only in the post-World War II era that the cost of shipping has dropped so much that we put everything on the way. So that's intermediate manufacturing, that's low value added commodities, things that normally you would produce and consume locally. It used to be it was all pretty much luxury goods or something of very high value. Now it's a little bit of everything. Well, and not even the knockoff iPhone chargers, the components that might go into the knockoff iPhone chargers. And we're kind of in this soft moment in history where everyone's holding their breath and wondering if the next time there's an incident, the U.S. is going to intervene or not. And I would argue we are not. Part of this is political. The Biden administration is the most populist administration we have ever had, more so than Trump. Basically, it feels like on trade policy, the Biden administration is going through Trump's tweets and picking them out one at a time and expanding them into position papers and putting them into policy and running a really good grammar scrubber over it. And we're basically getting the second Trump administration right now from a trade point of view. And then second, even if we wanted to intervene, this isn't the 60s or 70s. I mean, it used to be that there were no other naval powers. And so the United States with the destroyer-heavy Navy after World War II could patrol the global oceans because there wasn't a lot of competition and we had the right tools for the job. But since 1990, we've retooled our Navy, we've retired most of our smaller vessels, and we've concentrated naval power into our supercarrier battle groups. And if you want to knock off a country, that is the tool. But if you want to patrol the global oceans in an environment where other people have ships, you don't need the dozen supercarrier battle groups we have. You need like 800 destroyers. We only have 70. So even if we wanted to be the global policeman and patrol the waves, we no longer have the physical capacity to do it. Now, that sounds bad, and it is, but keep this in mind. The United States is the least maritime trade-dependent country in the world. Only 12% of our GDP is from trade. About half of that is NAFTA. We're not the ones who suffer if global trade breaks down. Mm-hmm. China's at the top of that list. Europe is a close second. China utterly lacks the naval capacity to project power more than about 1,000 miles from its coast. And it is completely dependent upon resource access and market access in countries that are half a world away. Now, the Chinese currently have 3 aircraft carriers floating. The first one used to be a casino, an actual casino in Ukraine. Yeah. They will never claim that it is combat capable. They just bought it from Ukraine to refurbish it so they could learn how it works.
Okay.
Their second one is a clone of the one that used to be the casino. The one that used to be the casino used to be a Russian carrier. They called it the Kuzanov, by the way, and the Soviets thought it was a disaster. During Soviet times, with Soviet resources, it just kind of caught on fire from time to time. Okay. Anyway, so the Chinese do not claim that these two will ever be combat capable.
Okay.
They're training for their engineers more than anything else. And they do have a third one that they're going through sea trials right now. And it is a larger carrier that they actually designed themselves. But again, it's a prototype. They don't view it as anything other than a test bed. So they might get their first carrier in 2027.